Thanks, Acting President. I rise to speak on the Sex Work Decriminalisation Bill 2021, and at the outset I'll say that Darren Hinch's Justice Party will be supporting this bill. I look forward to making a respectful contribution to this debate, given the stigma attached to sex work, but I suppose my contribution might be a little bit different in that I want to acknowledge the inherent vulnerabilities associated with sex work. It is only fair to the victims of crime who have been sex workers that we recognise this. I'd like to state that given decriminalising sex-based street work will make this group of vulnerable women safer, we think it is a good step forward. But I'll discuss further our position on brothel workers and the missed opportunity this bill has faced. However, the way this bill has been put together is quite frankly unprecedented. On such an important issue, it is imperative that we get this right, and on so many levels, this consultation has let some people down. 2 weeks at the end of August was the consultation period. Interestingly, the bill was presented to Parliament just 6 weeks later. The government apparently conducted the consultation and then considered the 900 plus submissions and introduced a bill 6 weeks later. Now, I could be cynical, but I could bet that this bill was partially, if not completely, drafted before the August consultation period. It went ahead anyway to give the impression that the government consulted everyone. This is because many stakeholders were excluded from the pattern review months and months earlier. Brothel owners and women's advocacy groups among them. Well, the Victims of Crime Commissioner wasn't fooled. She issued a statement when the bill was released. In it, she noted that the government was implementing the review's recommendations, but wouldn't publicly release the pattern review itself. She stated, and I quote, "I want to express my dissatisfaction and disappointment with the review process," unquote. And it goes on to list a number of ways the consultation was anything but satisfactory. What was most poignant about this letter were these words, and I quote, "Without a transparent approach to the research and consultation, it is not clear how the pattern review assessed the safety and well-being of sex workers and their risks of violence and exploitations," unquote. The Municipal Association of Victoria had issues along similar lines, saying, and I quote, "We are surprised and deeply disappointed in the limited amount of time Victoria's 79 councils and the MAV have been provided with to respond to the proposed changes," unquote. This just demonstrates the double standard that we have witnessed throughout this whole debate. Ms Patton and the sex work lobby want to recognise the sex industry as any other type of industry, but won't release any details about this report. The irony here is that in the response to an FOI request for the report by another stakeholder, the government stated, and I quote, "Disclosure of the document would be contrary to the public interest because they relate to matters on which government has not yet made a final decision. Such disclosure could lead to debate outside of the established decision-making processes that are in place for such matters, which would interfere with and potentially undermine the process," unquote. What process? The process of democracy. Given the government has made a final decision on the policy, why shouldn't it be released now, if this was indeed the basis for refusal? The government has since told my office that privacy concerns are the reasons for not releasing the report, because it names sex workers who were consulted. Notwithstanding that most sex workers use pseudonyms, my office communicated that we would be happy to receive a redacted version, but we have heard nothing. On asking at the crossbench bill briefing, we were told there would be a feedback report provided to MPs, and this was supposed to capture the consultation, including generally who was consulted and, more importantly, who wasn't. To date, as of today, we have not seen a feedback report. It is not surprising to see the bill being more contentious than it needed to be. The person asked to conduct the review, Ms Patton, has petitioned for the sex industry in the past and is the head of a key lobby group. In 2015, my colleague acknowledged that women with heroin addictions would not often choose to be sex workers if they thought they had an alternative but stopped short of calling it exploitive. She has lobbied for decades for the availability of liquor in brothels and a number of other things that the bill will also codify. I'm trying to ensure that this doesn't happen again with my amendment that will require the VLRC to conduct the review of the legislation in 5 years, which I shall speak about later. We don't even know if the New Zealand model or any other country's approach has been considered. New Zealand's law decriminalised street-based sex work offences, provided more rights for sex workers, such as work cover, removed the policing approach and replace it with a workplace health and safety approach. Importantly though, it still maintains a certification system for brothels that have more than 4 workers, called a brothel owner certificate. This is a sensible, and even if it was considered, we don't know why it was knocked back through the review that we can't see. The Victims of Crime Commissioner's submission called for a fit and proper person standard, as is required in other industries, of which I completely agree, and I'm curious as to if this was considered or not. To make all of this just a little bit more archaic, we also don't know what regulations will be in place to promote or require safe sex practices on advertising or any other regulation for that matter. That will apparently be sorted out later. One of the main reasons, aside from reducing stigma, that we will support the bill is encouraging sex workers to come forward with intelligence about crime. We believe and hope that the intel given to police by sex workers would benefit hugely by decriminalising street-based offences. We also hope that relationships with police benefit. My staff have been met with the question by pro-sex work lobbyists that echoes the discussion paper of why should sex work be different to any other workplace. The Victims of Crime Commissioner puts this best, and I quote, "While this is an admirable objective, it is potentially naive to hold other industries up as safe workplaces that can be replicated in the context of the sex work industry and its complexities of workplace safety. In my words, it is an inherently dangerous occupation for workers. Maybe not all, but certainly many. We know that many violent sexual predators often exploit sex workers as a precursor to more heinous crimes. Adrian Bailey is a sick and tragic but prime example. Well, this all makes sense to us as a Justice Party. It's really the way the bill has been put together that we find issue with. I want to reiterate something I said earlier about some people not acknowledging to recognise the inherent vulnerabilities of sex workers. To reduce stigma, we need to recognise that those that are sex workers, they could be someone who has a single mother, someone who has a substance abuse issue, someone who is homeless, or someone who has a history of trauma and abuse, and of course those who choose to be sex workers. This is not the entire industry. My office spoke to some incredible people speaking on behalf of the sex work lobby, and I thank them for their time. Our party was designed to support children and the vulnerable, and whether people choose to admit it or not, sex workers are vulnerable. Studies have shown that involvement in sex work tends to be transient and opportunistic. According to the AIDS Council of New South Wales, the average period spent in the sex industry is about 2.5 years. This is backed up by a Crimes and Misconduct Commission report from Queensland that found that most sex workers indicate they would like the opportunity to retrain for another career. And to reinforce this, a 2015 Australian Institute of Criminology report into migrant sex workers in Australia found that half of such workers would stop sex work if they found other ways to earn money. I'd like to reiterate that you can have a respectful debate and encourage destigmatising of the industry whilst acknowledging the complex reality of sex work. A range of research pieces by Perkins, Pivot Legal Society, Sanders and Campbell, Childwise and Lance found that the people most likely to become sex workers were women entering sex work because of childcare responsibilities, supplementing family income, following relationship breakdowns and finding themselves single income earners, those who have less state care need to find an income, and increasingly university students who need to support themselves through university. The evidence is very, very mixed when it comes to drug use, but there is certainly substantial evidence to suggest that the sex worker community have a higher incidence of drug use. One of my staff visited St Kilda's Gatehouse CEO, who provided a world of knowledge about the street-based sex work industry. For those unaware, the Gatehouse is a safe space for women involved in street-based sex work in St Kilda. Over 98% of their clients have heroin or other substance abuse issues. They are homeless, experience intergenerational poverty, or have other challenges. They have 350 people coming through their drop-in centre every year needing help. Now tell me how this problem doesn't exist. I was glad to read that Ms Patton has actually visited the facility back in December, as I know she is familiar with the vulnerability that I'm referring to. This is not to say that all sex workers are vulnerable or have dependencies. That's not what I'm saying. My point here is that by ignoring the evidence and clear reality that many sex workers actually need help with these things, like long-term employment, housing, AOD, mental health and other issues, we may find less of a dependence of such persons on sex work. Just on this, we have been informed that there are no longer any outreach programs for sex workers in Victoria. So despite the government and Ms Patton's intention to provide a safer place for sex workers, for those who want to leave the industry, there is no outreach help available. And this is incredibly disappointing. If you speak to Victoria Police Specialist Unit, you'll realise that things you didn't think could happen in this state actually do. Women are exploited for money. There are pimps. International students are pushed into sexual servitude to repay debts. This happens right here in this state. Here are some of the facts. One Melbourne study found that nearly all of the participants had experienced sexual assault or other violence, and I quote, at least once, unquote, since they started working, according to Childwise. Of concern is that a number of studies from the 70s until recent years have established clear links between childhood sexual abuse or other trauma of sex work. According to research, the correlation between intrafamilial childhood sexual abuse and sex work as an occupation vary between 31 and 73%. One sex worker my office spoke to told of her 11 years' experience as a sex worker in Queensland, New Zealand, New South Wales and Victoria. In each jurisdiction, despite their different laws, she would experience some sort of physical or sexual assault, including choking, which is one of the most common, bruises, bite marks and a range of other coercive behaviours. She says she has experienced stealthing at least 30 times. A 2015 survey undertaken by the Australian Institute of Criminology and the Scala Alliance that informed their migrant sex worker report found that 80% of respondents came from Chinese-speaking countries. Shockingly, more than half have experienced domestic violence in the past, with some still seeking basic financial stability after fleeing abusive relationships.
Sorry, Mr. Grimley. Thank you. I have to interrupt business and move to question time.